So recently, there's been quite a lot of talk around cloud outages and what that means for businesses, and that completely relies on hyperscalers. At OneGrid, we believe that there's opportunity that lies between a hybrid approach when it comes to hosting. And today we're unpacking this a little bit more with Mark Zili, the CTO of MoyaApp. We're going to discuss how businesses can make smarter infrastructure decisions, and that brings a balance of cost and control into the business. So welcome, Mark, and thank you very much for joining us.
That's great to be here. Thank you.
So, Mark, before we get into the technical side of things, could you please tell us a little bit more about your role at Moya App and what your focus is as CTO?
Yeah, sure. Just starting a bit before MoyaApp, I guess. Really,
Yeah.
I've had a foot in a number of different companies and industries over time. I've been working a fair bit in the hosting industry to start with, and then various bits of consultancy, and then started at MoyaApp about 4.5 years ago. I'm the CTO there. What that means is I look after all of our tech stuff. Obviously, I probably spend about half my time managing the team and half my time doing hands-on coding. So I'm still very involved in building out a lot of our foundational infrastructure and so on. Yeah, Moya App is. You can tell from my accent, I'm from the UK and still based there originally. But MoyaApp is fundamentally a South African company. We were spun out of Data Free, which provides reverse build data services. So if you've got a website that you want to be accessible to people even when they don't have data on their mobile phone, you can use Data Free to be a sort of go-between where they charge you rather than the end user having to have the data. That was a great product, and that was started maybe 10 years ago, something like that, and is very popular in South Africa and has expanded to other countries. Off the back of that, they came up with this idea of, well, what is a low data usage but very impactful in South African society service that we could deliver? And the idea of Moya App was formed. I think it was about the end of 2017, 2018. And obviously, we know there's big challenges in cost of data in South Africa. According to our stats, users in the townships, we've got about 4 million users, something like that, most of
Wow.
whom live in townships. And they only have access to mobile data maybe half the time at most, often around payday, or you buy very short-term packets, an hour or a day or something like that. Moya app provides a messaging platform which is always on, kind of like a WhatsApp, but it relies on data, but we provide that data if you don't have it on your device. So it enables people to message even when they've run out of data packets. And then we've also got a number of other apps, so you can check football scores, you can message with various chatbots and providers. You can look at what the weather forecast is. Some of those things are data free. Some of those things are provided by various partners of ours, and some of those you have to use your own data for. But we've become kind of a super app in South Africa. So it's very interesting, both from a societal point of view and for the good we're able to do in South Africa, but also obviously running a platform with 4 million active users is technically very interesting as well. I started 4.5 years ago, and we were spun out of data free about that time. So I think I was probably fully focused on Moya from the beginning. I was probably about the second or third person that was hired there. And we've since grown to be a company where we've got about 40 or 50 people, depending on how you count the various contractors and so on that we use. And the tech team's about 15 people, something like that.
And I'm sure that from a hosting perspective, what you originally had spec'd and where it got grown to today is vastly different because it's such a huge success story.
Yeah, absolutely. So the initial build was always on AWS. We started from zero back in 2017, 2018, and very quickly, just purely through word of mouth, I think within a month it was up to 60,000 users, and within a year or two it was up to the millions of users. So obviously, the initial ramp out of this required very quick scaling, and actually. Some of the internal services were AWS or Google Cloud, but we were initially using a software as a service for the messaging platform. And so one of my first jobs when I came in was, well, let's migrate to our own in-house messaging platform. And then eventually we actually moved that on from AWS to OneGrid. And I guess we'll talk about that journey a little bit
Yeah.
further on in the conversation.
Okay, so I was just thinking if we can take one step back, I've already mentioned this word once and it's probably going to come up a few times again. But for those who don't know, could you just describe what a hyperscaler is?
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to pin down, but I guess the essential elements would be that it's a very large company. They would have lots of data centers. A typical hosting provider would have a handful of data centers, or maybe only space in, but wouldn't actually operate the data centers themselves. Whereas hyperscalers are dealing with hundreds of thousands, millions of servers across 10, 20, 30, maybe even up to the hundreds of data centers or co-location services in the world. They would also provide not just what we would call bare metal or virtual machine, like the foundational servers. They also provide various layers of services on top of that. So if you wanted, for example, a database, you just go to them and you say, I want a database, rather than, I need these two servers and I need to set up replication between them and I want this version, and all of that kind of maintenance overhead that you'd have to do. So they abstract away a lot of the technical complexity around the operational side and let you focus a lot more on just delivering your core business product, your core business value, I suppose.
Okay, thank you for that. Definitely explained that very well. Um, so often when people refers to I'm moving into the cloud, I think your person in the street would literally see a cloud, but the reality is that it's not quite that, and there's different levels to cloud. Could you perhaps just take us through what those levels look like and where most businesses sit today?
Yeah, sure. I think we all use the cloud and maybe understand a little bit about the cloud to a certain degree. But I mean, the idea initially of the cloud is that it's just something out there, like the white fluffy things you see in the sky, and you don't need to worry about any of the complexities of infrastructure. It just works and delivers what you've asked for. The reality, of course, is that this is physical data centers, just as there have always been for the past 40, 50, 60 years. There's behind that, there's servers, behind that, there's teams of technical people. And but it's really a sort of an abstraction layer, the idea that you can grow infinitely, and that's true to an extent, but it will also cost you, both in terms of finances, but also in terms of various bits of technical debt and various vendor lock-ins as well. So what I found quite useful, there's a guy in Holland called Bert Hubbard, who is quite famous. He's a very technical guy. He built some of the underpinnings of the internet, software called Power DNS, which would be used in many hyperscalers and data centers throughout the world. And since exiting that company, he's been quite a vocal voice on European sovereign independence in terms of the cloud. So he's writes lots of articles on his blog, explaining in sort of politicians, layman's, but also technical terms, different aspects of the cloud and why, in particular, Europe needs to build its own hyperscaler or cloud to be a bit dependent of some of the traditional hyperscalers like AWS or Google or Microsoft Azure. So, as part of his kind of fundamental explanation, I guess, he's got these six levels of cloud, which he defines. So the first level, I guess, is where you run and operate your own data center or your own all of your own hardware. You own all of that yourself. There's not many companies that want to do that. Certainly not many small businesses or anything that really want to do that because there's a lot of cost, there's a lot of technical, there's a lot of maintenance that's involved in that. So that's the first level. The second level is where you have a provider like OneGrid, but you just use virtual machines or you buy co-location space. So you're renting servers, you're offloading the complexities of the networking and the power and the cooling arrangements, but you're not really doing anything particularly flexible. So that's level two. Level three would be where you've built your code and you're kind of deploying your code in what we call containers. So you're not worrying about servers and networking and things like that. You've got your own containers, you're deploying them on these servers, and they can then, in theory, grow infinitely. So, with the level two, you don't really get the scaling. You have to go and manually provision servers or whatever through a console. With level three, you'd expect the operator to just automatically scale. If I suddenly get a million requests, it would scale up lots of containers, and they would handle all of that without me having to worry about it. That would be level three. Level four, they start adding on different bits of functionality. So again, rather than having to say, I need to create a database, I need to have two or three database servers, they need to talk to each other, all of that. You just say, look, I want a database, give me the username and password, I'll plug it into my infrastructure. And that is available in a lot of different places. So, the likes of OneGrid or other hosting providers can do that as well, and usually, a fair bit cheaper than the hyperscalers can. Where the hyperscalers really come into their own is on the next step, the level five. And that is where something like AWS has hundreds of services. They all integrate with each other. You've got like an authentication service, so I don't need to worry about storing users' usernames, passwords, all of that stuff. I can use the AWS service for that. I don't need to worry about logging or monitoring. Again, there's an AWS service for that. I don't need to worry about looking through my log files and scanning for stuff and making sure my service is available. They just do all of that. So it's kind of offloading your a lot of your technical department there, and you get to just wire it together in a web browser in a nice interface. And that's really where the hyperscalers are currently in a sort of league of their own, I suppose. And then the top level, number six, according to Bert, and I think this is quite a useful sort of breakdown or summary, is what we call software as a service. So I don't worry about servers, I don't worry about anything. Let's say I need an accounting package. I just go to this website and it pops up with my accounting package that does this. Or I use Zoom, like we're recording this on at the moment. That's software as a service. I don't worry about provisioning a Zoom server. I just click on a link and I go to it. And this will be hosted and managed by another company. So that's more Microsoft 365 or Gmail or these things. They're all services that are provided to us, and we don't have to worry about the complexities behind it. So I think what we'd really be talking about today is probably the differences between like levels three, which is the sort of basic containers, four, which is the managed databases and infrastructure, and then five, which is really the cloud native, where you get all of these different services that you can plug together, which the various big hyperscalers provide, but not really many other people provide.
Thank you for that. It definitely gives us a very good insight. So many business believe that when they move to the cloud, they do so to save money or reduce the technical team requirements. But in your experience, are those good reasons to adopt cloud services?
Yeah, so I think there's some bad reasons, and there are also some good reasons. I guess, we explained in the journey of Moya, right? How we started using a software as a service, and eventually that was not quite as reliable as we would have liked. It was also a lot more expensive than it needed to be. And when we were dealing with millions of users, I ran the numbers and I said, look, it's cheaper to hire a couple of guys who can run the system and do an awful lot of other stuff on the side and bring it in-house than it is to keep on spending all of this money with this provider. I mean, I think it was something around a million euros a year or that kind of ballpark that we were spending on the messaging platform. And so we bought it in-house, we put it on AWS because we kind of knew more about what the base load was like. We didn't need something that could scale from 0 to 10 million really easily. We knew, hey, we're at 2 million users. We know it's got a rough trajectory. We can order servers in advance, etc. And so we brought it onto AWS and probably halved our bills by doing that. And then a few years down the line, we said, well, look, this is on AWS, but we're only really using levels sort of three or four on AWS. We can do all of that in-house. We can do it a lot more cheaply, a lot more effectively with OneGrid that we eventually partnered with on that. And so we know there's some trade-offs there. OneGrid, at the time at least, only had the one data center, whereas in AWS we had three data centers we could use in Cape Town, for example. So you lose a little bit potentially around reliability, although we've not found that to be an issue there. And you also obviously lose some of the nice bits that you get with AWS of ease of use. But for for making something three, four, five times cheaper, when you reach a certain level of scale, it does make a lot of sense to think about that. I think the problem that a lot of companies have is cloud is great when you're starting out. You can go very, very low cost. But the moment you start getting user growth, or if you configure something wrong, the bill can skyrocket incredibly quickly. So it does give you a lot of flexibility, but it does also come with a cost there. This is very, very good when you're initially starting, when you've got your startup credits or something like that. If you need a lot of flexibility, if you have a AI training workload where you need some very, very expensive servers for a couple of days, it's great. But if you've just got a standard load, we know, hey, we've got 4 million users, it's just going to keep on being like that. It's going to change plus or minus 10%, 20% over a year. You can calculate your infrastructure in advance and you can save a lot of money and complexity as well by doing that. And it's not just us that's finding that. I think probably in the mid 2010s, a lot of businesses went all in with the cloud, and they were promised great cost savings. As you obviously you get tiered discounts as you spend more money with them, you lock in for longer periods of time, and they were promised, hey, you don't need to worry at all about the infrastructure. You can just focus on what your core business value is. But there's a number of businesses at the moment, and I think probably the most vocal of which is 37 Signals Basecamp, run by a guy called David Heinemeier Hannesson, who created Ruby on Rails. And they've spent the past couple of years migrating away from the cloud onto their own servers. They reckon that's somewhere between 5 and 10 times cheaper than AWS. And they reckon, because he was all in on cloud about 10 years ago, they reckon they've wasted somewhere in the region of $10 million
Wow.
over this experiment, only to then be bringing it back in-house at a vastly simplified infrastructure level and an increased, massively increased savings. So yeah, there's a lot of advantages there. Um, Another probably bad reason to pick the cloud is this idea, especially in very large businesses, that if you get the cloud, then you can reduce your technical headcount. And that's quite attractive. Technical people, very good technical people, are hard to come by and can be quite expensive, maybe a bit difficult to work with. Um, but I think fundamentally, certainly for the businesses that I've been involved in, which have been sort of tech focused, but I think even for larger businesses, you still need to retain a very strong tech team. And actually, I think one of the reasons we've been able to build and retain a very strong tech team in Moya is because we're doing stuff that's a bit more interesting. If you're just in the AWS console and you're clicking around, it doesn't require a lot of challenge. And what tech guys like is something of a challenge there as well. So you can maybe save some money in the short run by moving to cloud, although even then it tends to be quite a complex operation. But the moment something goes wrong, you need good technical people you can call on, and people that understand your infrastructure. And so I think there's a certain inflection point in the size of business where it makes a lot of sense to look at the overall cloud spend and say, well, does it make more sense to bring it in as headcount and reduce costs by moving off the cloud, if that's even possible? And then we've got the in-house talent, we can fix things more quickly, and we can improve on our standard OpEx there as well. So yeah, those are some of the reasons that I'm thinking of there.
So, I think let's tap a little bit into finding the balance of a hybrid approach, which I believe is the way MoyaApp went as well. So, often the best solution is not to have it all in one or the other. What does a healthy hybrid setup look like in practice? And that might look different for every business, but if you had to give advice on how would a company find the right balance? What does it look like?
So I was very privileged when we came into Moya that the initial version was great, but it was kind of creaking at the seams. It had never been developed in a particularly robust way on the infrastructure side. There'd been different consulting companies helping out with different bits. It had got to where it was, but we fundamentally had an opportunity to rebuild a lot of it from the ground up. And so we had a technical decision then, do we go all in with a particular cloud thing? So we could have built it against AWS and all of the shiny, what we'd call level five services there, which would make life easier. But what we decided to do was actually to build stuff that was effectively cloud or even deployment agnostic. So we went, and I think this is one of the trappings of cloud is that you can start a business and scale it where you're just buying into one particular ecosystem, and then you've got a massive case of vendor lock-in. As I say, at a particular point, the cost calculations become quite different. So I think it's very important, even from the beginning and also from when you're doing new development, to consider, well, do we want to be tied to this particular provider forever? Or do we want to maybe spend a little bit more time and energy up front in building something which can be moved between different places? And, it's fine. We can run that on AWS. We could potentially also run it on a different cloud or on a local thing. So the journey we've been through at Moya, as I say, is from software as a service to AWS to OneGrid for our messaging platform. But I mentioned, we only got kind of the single deployment, so there's a single point of failure now potentially. So what we did when we were doing the migration from AWS to OneGrid was we had that in mind, and we've set up a robust link from OneGrid into AWS. We replicate all of our data, and we have servers sitting there in standby. If there's ever an issue with OneGrid, which there hasn't been in the 2, 3 years that we've been hosted there, if there's no ever an issue with OneGrid, within an hour or two, we can move the whole platform onto AWS, spin that up. It doesn't cost us anything really, a few $1,000s a month, something like that, just to have that kind of resiliency there. If we did have to spin it up, then the cost would go a lot higher. But this is the flexibility the cloud gives you, is we can have those servers sitting there basically turned off, not doing anything. If we had that in a real data center, we'd be paying a fair amount for it. So we've got that failback. A lot of our core infrastructure also is hosted on these containers that we've built to be cloud agnostic, but we're hosting them in AWS. In AWS, there's a service called ECS, Elastic Container Service, which was good to start with. But again, we ran into some limitations with that, and we moved on to a Kubernetes type platform, which is another way of doing what we call container orchestration. And what we're investigating now is, okay, so we're doing all of that within AWS. Could we get some cost savings if we actually started trying to deploy those to another hosting provider? So we run the core of it still in AWS with the fail back into AWS, but we actually run the workloads on a remote hosting provider. And again, can we save thousands, tens of thousands of dollars a month by doing that? And it's through these sort of small incremental improvements in tech that we've been doing, and that we've had the flexibility to do because we've been able to build out the tech team, that we've reduced our technical OpEx by around 90% in the last 4.5 years. And that it's paid for the team many times over by doing that, simply because we're able to have some very good technical people that can do deep dives into problems. They can make sure that the stuff's going to keep on working. But just where we were at in terms of infrastructure, we had that opportunity where the costs started to make a lot more sense of, well, let's invest in people and get that to reduce the tech costs overall, in terms of the amount we spend on AWS and ancillary services.
I'm very glad to hear that you haven't had any major outages at OneGrid. But talk about outages, topical theme at the moment. When a major cloud provider experiences downtime, when that does happen, what kind of ripple effect does that have on a business such as yours that rely on it so heavily, or some that maybe doesn't have that hybrid option?
Yeah, so the AWS outage recently was fascinating. We've got a concept in DevOps that we call blast radius. So if you think of, if I throw a grenade, it has a small bang. If I drop a nuclear bomb, it's got a really big blast radius, right, and impacts a lot of stuff. And so for example, if a single data center somewhere went down, and there was good resiliency with other data centers, then no one would really notice. Or even if you were only in that data center, it would be a small blast radius. It would take some websites and servers offline, but the internet as a whole would continue working. The fascinating thing about this recent AWS outage last week was the scope of the blast radius
Mm.
was incredible. It turns out that whilst AWS does have these various availability zones, available regions, they're all meant to be separate from each other. What had happened was their primary data center or their primary region had issues, and a lot of some of their cleverer global services, such as DynamoDB, which is a database, and various other ones which were built on top of that, it was kind of like a dominoes cascading effect, where what was initially quite a small issue then cascaded. There were various other bits of failover as they bought various systems online, and then they started falling over. We call that the thundering herds problem, where all of this pent up request and demand comes in because you've had an outage for a few hours, and then suddenly you can't spin up things fast enough, and then you get cascade effects. So yeah, I mean they did a great job to bring it all back online, but it was a very long outage, and yeah, there was an awful lot of bits of internet that were impacted by that. I think that was primarily because people had bought into the idea of, well, we're in multiple regions in AWS. They should actually be all isolated, independent data centers
Yes.
effectively. But because of the complexity of it, there was an underlying fabric that they had depended on, but was actually maybe not as reliable and resilient as it seemed. And I'm sure now, there's going to be massive retrospective work done to mitigate that. I mean, all of the providers, every data center, every provider will have issues and outages occasionally, but the key is really minimizing the blast radius and also figuring out, well, what is a failover strategy? It takes an awful lot of effort. The ideal, presumably, would be to have something on AWS and something on Google Cloud, two totally separate instances, for example. But then you've got a lot of cognitive overhead to make sure the two systems are working properly, that it's all in sync, etc. And you've also got potentially quite a lot of cost. So as I was saying with our messaging platform, by having it on AWS for very little cost because we've scaled it right down to zero, and having it on OneGrid, we've effectively got that multi-cloud, that hybrid reliability there, because AWS doesn't depend on OneGrid and OneGrid doesn't depend on AWS. We should be in a much better position where if one or the other has a problem, we can rotate onto the other one and minimize. And yeah, customers would see impact. Messaging would maybe stop working for a small amount of time. We've not designed it to be automatic failover because that comes with a lot of its own complexities. But you'd have thought that a lot of these larger companies would have had a multi-cloud or sort of on-prem and in-cloud hybrid strategy where they could fail between two. It seems a lot of people have just put all of their eggs in the AWS basket, and yeah, AWS was promising higher reliability, but it turned out there were some single points of failure there that would cause these cascade effects effectively.
Absolutely. I'm cognizant of our time. We have about 5 more minutes together, if that's okay with you. Um, I wanted to just talk
Yeah,
quickly
sure.
about local infrastructure, what the advantages of it is, in terms of performance and latency and data compliance. Could you please comment a bit on that?
Yeah, so as I was explaining at the beginning, MoyaApp is fundamentally focused on South Africa. I mean, we'd love to expand to other places and offer our products and services elsewhere in the world where it'd be useful. But for the moment, we're fundamentally focused on serving South Africa the best we can. And so when we were looking for data center and hosting provider partners, then one of the key requirements was it needs to be in South Africa. If you look at the latency from Cape Town to Ireland and back, or Europe, it's 100, 200 milliseconds. And you think when you're establishing a connection from your browser, there needs to be at least three of those round trips, if not more. Then that 100, 200 milliseconds is a blink of an eye. But when you're doing three, four, five, six of those, that can turn into several seconds of additional latency. So for us, really being hosted close to where the mobile operators were, close to where people are, was an essential thing. So we actually have a split cloud strategy. We have AWS in Ireland because it's cheaper there. So we put our not so critical loads,
Mm.
not so critical latency loads there. We have AWS in Cape Town for latency. It's more expensive to host there, and there's a bit less flexibility because it's a sort of second tier AWS region. But it's essential for us to offer responsive services to people in South Africa. And then we've also got OneGrid, obviously, which is also based in Cape Town. So it just provides a much nicer experience. It's much quicker. And yeah, it's quite frustrating sometimes being in South Africa trying to access a global website, and it takes a second or two, or longer than I'm used to in the UK when I'm here. So yeah, we want to deliver the best experience we can to our users in South Africa, and yeah, being co-located there is actually essential for that.
Thank you, Mark. Last piece of advice to South African businesses when it comes to building resilient digital infrastructure, what would you say?
It's so important to think about it beforehand, really. I think
Yeah,
that's fundamentally like
yeah,
there's always going to be trade-offs. Obviously, the cloud gives you everything you could ever want, but it also has potentially a very large blast radius and is very expensive. There's trade-offs with all of the different ones, but you need to be hiring very good technical people beforehand that can be cognizant of all of this and give you a sort of very high level overview, I guess. Just like have a page of A4 paper or something that just highlights this was the decision that we made in terms of are we going to be building container based? Are we going to be building on physical servers? Are we going to be building tied to a particular cloud provider and all of their funky flexibility and services? And this is the rationale why. And then just reevaluate that every 6 months, every year, because maybe when your user base has scaled or your costs have scaled, the calculus becomes different. As I say, we went through that process a couple of times in MoyaApp of,
yeah.
well, actually, we're now at a point where it's much more cost effective to transition to a different model. So try and avoid tying yourself in beforehand, I think would really be my guiding principle. There's so many open source and good quality technologies now which
Mm.
are multi-cloud, portable, they'll work anywhere. Why would you not consider trying to use those at the beginning? And it gives you so much more flexibility at the future to control costs and yeah, control your own destiny as well.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. I certainly learned quite a bit myself, and I'm sure that our followers would also be learning quite a bit. Appreciate your time, and we'll be in touch soon.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great fun.